So there we are. Oh, Dr. Nick had a question, but now he's not there now. He's already left us a question. So there's his question. How do you catch an owl? Someone's on Facebook now, so that's good. Hello, Facebook. We're about to begin, just giving people a bit of time to come in, get comfortable. Oh, good. Yes, Dr. Nick, hello. We do have the questions. Here we are. It's the bird emergency. I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd. And I'm joined for the second time by, there we are, Dr. Bronwyn Isaac, who has done the Powerful Owl episode with me. Hi, Bronwyn.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me back.
Well, we're here by request. Thanks to Dr. Nick from Queensland. Dr. Nick, I think, is in the house. Dr. Nick in the house. If you can type something for us, Dr. Nick, tell us what your particular owl interest is so that we can make this very informal and very chatty and very friendly. I do have both of your questions here and we'll address them bit by bit, but just if you're in the room, tell us why you're here to learn about owls, because I think people are fanatics, Bronwyn, when it comes to I mean, there's raptor peeps, right? But owl raptor peeps are especially special, aren't they?
Owls are pretty charismatic. They either tend to strike fear into people or they just make you fall in love. I think I mentioned it last time. I originally actually wanted to be a mammal ecologist at the very, very start before I did my honours. And I went out and I saw my first powerful owl and I just fell in love, and that was it. End of story. It was just powerful owl all the way from there.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, viewers, we've got a bit of a process to step through, but where possible, or where appropriate, I'll stop for questions. But the first thing we're going to go through, Bronwyn had produce some lovely visuals. What do we actually need to consider right at the start? We've got our project, or you've got your project idea. Let's. You mentioned to me before we press the go button that you've worked with quite a few different owls. So, what was the first project you did with owls?
So it actually wasn't more. My first project was with powerful owls, and that was my honours, and that wasn't actually any handling of owls. That was looking at breeding hollows and the characteristics that they needed for breeding hollows. But when I started my PhD, right at the start, it was always about looking at where these owls go. So once I'd put in my project, I'd put through my ethics, the multiple levels of ethics. I actually wasn't allowed to go out and start catching owls until I went and did some training. And that leads into sort of my first sort of lot of owl work, which was up in the Pilliga. So I went up there in New South Wales for, I think it was a week or 2 weeks, I can't remember exactly. And I worked with Rod Kavanagh and Matt Stanton up there, and they taught me how to catch owls. And our target species up there was actually the barking owl. So a little bit smaller than the powerful owl, but highly dependent on woodlands and woodland environments. Then after I did that little bit of training, I went down to East Gippsland and I did some training with another PhD student, and he was working on powerfuls and sooty owls. So that was sort of my second lot. And this was before I even got a chance to go out and start catching powerful owls. So I did a fair bit of training, and in the more recent times, I've been lucky enough to co-supervise a PhD student who's working on the Norfolk Island mopoke. So I got to go over to Norfolk Island and work with a tiny, teeny, tiny owl who's only about 200 grams and is very different than handling sort of a owl that's up around 1,700 grams. So a lot of versatile experiences there.
So just before we go through your 10 steps, which you prepared, tell us about that process of getting ethical approval to undertake a study, and particularly one where you are going to be handling birds, trapping them, and are there different steps in the ethical approval process when you may be dealing with nestlings or breeding birds compared to non-breeding birds? Just give us an idea of how difficult the process is, how rigid it is.
So I guess the first sort of major hurdle is that you need to apply through your university. And basically they have an animal ethics committee, standard paperwork that you fill in, and you draw from sort of literature who have already done those sort of techniques before you. So it's a lot of standardization in that respect. But however, once you get it through that first level, that's only the first hurdle. You then have to actually get your ethics approved via the governing body. So here it's DELP in Victoria that would have to sign off on that before I'm even allowed to head out into the field. So I guess the second part of that question is, yes, the ethics does vary quite greatly depending on what you want to do. So in some countries like the US, if you're a researcher and you just wanted to go out and observe birds, like, stand there and look at them, you wouldn't actually need ethics. Here in Australia, if you just want to go out and observe birds, then yes, you do need ethics. I think the ethics, the level of ethics is more closely tied to, say, for example, if you want to work on a more common species, it's a little bit easier to get ethics through. However, if you want to work on a, highly endangered species or a critically endangered species, the process is a little bit more, it's all rigorous, but it's a little bit tougher at that end of the scale. And again, depending on what you want to do. So, if I wanted to take bloods or do invasive things like that, then I would have to do additional training to show that I'm competent in those areas.
So it's kind of like a risk assessment process for the animal as well as for you. You got to make sure that everybody's safe. You're not going to be causing undue stress or annoyance, not going to have an impact on breeding success or anything like that. So and there's also some rules around things. So I'll talk about powerfuls here, but for example, you're not supposed to catch owls during sort of the time when the female goes into the holo. After that, you need to stop catching because you can have an undue effect on their breeding success. That seems pretty fair. Well, it's probably a good time now to bring up the 10 steps, and then maybe that question that that Dr. Nick asked about, how do you catch a powerful owl, we'll go through in slide number 2, I think, Bronwyn. So here we are, the 10 steps. Let's walk through what they are, how long it takes. Let's go. The floor is yours.
Step 1 and 2 kind of go hand in hand. So basically, before we even think about catching, we often have a look at sort of atlas records, known observations, those sorts of things, to get an idea of where the owls might be. But then we actually start to look for signs. So there's sort of 3 main signs that we look for. So the first one is whitewash. Whitewash alone, which is in the bottom picture here, is not necessarily an indicator of the owl being there, because lots and lots of different birds actually poo. So there's that. but we're actually looking for 3 signs. So we look for the whitewash on the ground. We then also look for things like pellets, which is basically just regurgitated bits of the prey animals that the owls actually can't digest. So things like bones, hair, those sorts of things. And the third sort of sign that we're looking for is the feathers. So if we've got all of those signs present in an area, it's pretty likely that there's a powerful owl close by. Then what we need to do is we need to do some diurnal searching. So we walk around during the day and we actually look for where the owl is roosting during the day. And because powerful owls actually change roosts quite often, it doesn't mean that, you know, they'll be very far away, but, you know, they'll be in a different tree at a different height, all of those sorts of things. We actually need to identify where the roost is on the day that we're going to actually try to catch them. There's some other considerations that we have to take into play as well, and that is things like if it's going to rain. So if it's going to rain, we don't tend to catch because the success of actually catching the owl declines quite dramatically. So once we've sort of done that sort of pre-work, then we actually need to find a place that's suitable to set up the net. So this may sound easy, but the net is around 10 to sort of 15 meters in dimension. So it looks like this. One of the PhD students actually put this together I think he used PowerPoint to put it together, Nick Bradsworth. So this is kind of what it looks like. So what we're looking for is 2 fairly large trees with no obstacles sort of in between. But on each side of that net, we actually want trees or vegetation that is at a lower level than those 2 big sort of anchor trees, if you want to call about it. Then what we do is we actually use a bow and arrow. There are sort of slingshots often that tree climbing people use, but we've found the bow and arrow actually works a lot better. It doesn't have a pointy tip on the end of the arrow. We actually take that off and we put sort of like a heavy weight on there, and that helps us get our lines up.
So that's to lob the lines, like in this diagram, over those forks, so that you can then hoist
set up the pulley system.
Yeah, hoist up the pulleys.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So, yeah. Okay. So that step is you've got your arrow goes over the bow, it comes to the ground, and then you attach the pulley to that, and then pull that line back up over the tree. Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the point of having the lower vegetation other than like lower, and is it behind or to the sides of the net? Is it really just to make sure that the bird can't see the net because there are things behind it or in front of it, so that it won't be just focusing on this empty space with with the net in between?
So the aim of having that vegetation that sort of surrounds the net a bit shorter is that what we actually do is that we run speakers out either side. So, you know, from the area that the owl's coming from and the other side of the net. And then we actually use owl vocalizations to bring the owl in. So
now, are they territorial kind of calls?
Yeah.
Or are they flirty calls?
We use a combination. So we use, cool, you know, a male call, a female call. Sometimes we use chicks, especially if they've got chicks, like chicks out of the nest and hanging around. The chick call can actually bring the adults in faster because they come in to investigate. So basically having that lower vegetation around the outside, our goal is that if they're on one side of the net, we use the vocalizations on the other side. And because the vegetation is lower, they've got nowhere to go but through our net. If, say, for example, the vegetation around that site is much higher, then basically what we end up is a scenario where the owls are going over the top of our net, and we can't pull our net up any higher.
So you're kind of funneling them in to
Yes.
that area, but also giving them a sense of security in that it's still a foresty kind of area that they're used to flying through. So you wouldn't you can't do it in a clearing, I think is the main point. It just doesn't make sense.
We have to have enough of a clearing where the net is, because the last thing you want is to be dropping a net into vegetation or anything like that, because A, that's not safe for the owl, and B, it will mess up the net. But yeah, you need reasonable vegetation around. You don't tend to catch where there's a lot of deforestation.
Yeah. Okay. Now, have you seen that? Can you see that question that Dr. Nick's posed, which I was going to ask as well? I'm glad he's done it because I'd already flown past it. Why don't you catch when it's raining, which you mentioned?
Generally because it's wet and it's horrible, and you don't want to be handling an owl and sort of, messing up all their feathers.
Okay.
But I don't know if it's whether they fly less, but they definitely don't tend to respond as well to the playback. And we've just found that, the more you actually do playback, if you're trying to catch an owl in a particular area, the more chances they have of becoming acclimatized to that and then not responding at all. So you need to be really careful when you pick the time to actually go out and catch the owls.
I guess that raises another issue, Bronwyn. It's something that always comes up when we talk about photography and using playback to lure birds in and things like that. You probably have the issue of modifying behaviour when you're studying birds the same pair, and if you're using playback regularly. Like, do you have to source different recordings so that you're not always playing the same recording of a particular call?
So when we don't tend to source new recordings, because the number of recordings is quite low that we've got for the powerful owls. But because we use sort of a combination, and we only use the playback when we're catching. So, and we sort of space out our catching.
Yeah, that question really that Dr. Nick's just put up is really an extension of what I was asking. Is the use of playback something that in your initial ethics discussion with your supervising or advisory committee, do they give you guidelines, or tell us a little bit about that, because the whole issue of playback, be it any research or photography or whatnot, is questionable right at the start. You have to make a compromise, don't you? That the very minute that you decide to use playback.
So I guess one of the lucky things about studying powerful owls is there's people that have done it before. And there's also guidelines for playback across the board for, other species as well. So, all of that is taken into consideration. And, the last thing we want is owls to become accustomed to playback and change their behavior. So we only use it when we actually need it. I actually haven't heard of that many people using playback to call in owls to photograph them, for example. But if they are, I actually hope they stop that behavior, because while I haven't had that situation, the only time I've seen the powerful owls actually change their behavior was when the site actually got put on one of the central birding sort of things, and everyone was going out there at that particular time taking photos. And basically I just went out one night to check. It wasn't even the breeding season, and I've never ever been swooped or even close to swooped, and the female actually swooped me, and I went, nope, that's it, I'm out of here. Obviously, she's stressed out. Something's happening here. And yeah, with a bit more investigation, it was found that, you know, there were a lot of people visiting the site and she just wasn't very happy whatsoever with all the people around all the time. So
Yeah, that's a really vexed issue, isn't it? Because those of us that have got a really keen interest in birds like to photograph birds, and I know Dr. Nick loves to photograph his local owls, which
I have absolutely no problems with people photographing them because, you know, unless you get people to care about something, you're not going to be able to conserve it.
That was really where I was going. It's got an educational point of view. It's an awareness point of view. It helps people understand that the birds are around. The problem is when you get people who are not sympathetic to what the birds need, who are then going there, and it's a bit like Twitchers with their scorecards. You know, it's like.
You're going to open a can of worms here if you start picking on the Twitchers with their scorecards.
Well, no, but I always go to this because I think it's an issue that you always need to think about when you are going into the field, whether you're going there to tick off a list or to see something you've never seen before, or to get photographs, or the myriad reasons that people go out into the environment. You're there making a difference. You are impacting on what the other critters do in their normal life, and you need to. I think you need to be aware of that with everything you do, even just going for a bushwalk. You need to be aware that you're stepping on orchids, or maybe trampling a lizard's favourite sunning spot. All these things you need to just. I'm not saying don't do them, but if you think about them, you can be less of a ogre or a giant stumbling through, you know, which is how some people do their recreation. All right, let's get off my hobby horse there. What's the next thing we do? Do we do the processing or the health? It's the processing next, isn't it?
Yeah, so once an owl actually flies in and lands in the net, what we do is we release it fast enough so that the owl becomes entangled, but not so fast that it sort of hits the ground, because we don't want that to happen. And then basically it's sort of all hands on deck. We move in, and the first thing that we need to do is we need to actually get hold of the legs of the owl. So anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was actually taught how to do this, we were taught that it was a chicken grip, which basically meant that sort of you have the two legs of the owl, and then you've got your 3 fingers, and you put it in and you go type like that. And basically once you immobilize the legs, it means that the talons are now out of play. So with raptors, the talons are the most dangerous part. I would rather get bitten by a powerful owl than I would get grabbed by the talons. If you think about it.
Sorry, Bronwyn, I noticed in this photo there are 2 people. One of them is you.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing big, heavy leather gloves. You're not wearing gloves when you're handling the birds?
No. So, you know, you're used to seeing people when you go to sort of Hillsville or somewhere like that using big, heavy leather gloves. We actually need all of our tactility when we're actually handling these birds. So we actually don't wear gloves at all. And that's why it's most important that we get hold of those talons really quickly. And then we work to quickly disentangle the owl out of the net. And then what you'll probably see up sort of near my hand, it's sort of brown in that picture. We basically put a beanie over the head of the owl.
I was going to ask if you know, sort of, what's the word? Cap them, really, isn't it? It's like
so that's sort of got a couple of different purposes. The first one is it's really hard for them to bite you if they've got a beanie on their head.
Which is
the second one is that they are nocturnal species, so they fly around at night. we are not nocturnal. We are diurnal. We see best in the daylight.
Yep.
So we actually need head torches to be able to do all of the work that we need to do.
So you don't want to like damage them or disorient them with a bright beam that you've got on your headband there.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So where was I? We've got them out the net. I'm holding them. The other thing that we do is we put so where my hand is there, it's the top hand is sort of on the back of their wings. So once we've immobilized their legs, we've sort of immobilized their wings by putting a hand on their back, and they've got their beanie on the head. Usually they kind of go, I'm a topwater predator. Oh my God, she's got me. I give up. And basically then they sort of just sit there. However, if at any point you tend to loosen the grip on their legs or loosen sort of your hand off their back, and they feel like that they can try to escape, they will start to shuffle around in your hands. And I see Dr. Nick's just put in a question, and
I was going to ask you the same thing.
I meant to mention this earlier.
Yeah.
When doing field work, I have never been bitten or taloned by an owl. But when I was actually overseas at a conference, I was visiting somebody and they had an owl, a great horned owl in a cage that they used for part of their research. And I was very close to the cage and I got distracted because there was a wild one that had come down and started calling, and I actually got taloned in just above the eye. No. So that's my only injury, and it wasn't actually when I was properly working with owls, so I'm not counting that one.
I was going to extend the question. Does anyone in any of the teams that you've worked in had an episode with a talon or a beak?
No. I got slightly nipped by the Norfolk Island mopoke, but they are so tiny that it's just it's less than getting bitten by, say, a parrot, for example. So nobody in our teams have been injured to the point where they needed medical attention or anything like that.
Well, I think that tells us that your training and all your prep work is pretty good because you're not having mishaps in the field. Because if there's a talon injury or a beak injury to you, that means there's potentially some kind of damage, maybe muscle strains and all that might be happening for the birds. So that's good news all round if no one's getting got.
Gee, we also haven't had any birds injured as part of our research either. So that's a very good sign that we're doing good things.
That is. Now, on the picture that we've got up on this slide with the bird on the right, is that a tracker that's been attached?
Yeah. So after we've taken them out the net, I'll just take one step back. We tend to weigh them. So how we do that is we put them in a calico type bag. We tie the strings around their talons just to make sure that they can't get out and injure themselves. And we quickly invert them upside down and quickly weigh them and then put them back up so that they're not upside down for very long. But it's the quickest way to actually get a measure from them. And this can also tell us a lot about sort of their weight can tell us a lot about, if they're in good condition, that sort of stuff, as well as sort of the other aspects that we look for. Lucy says she would like to be nipped by a Norfolk Island mopoke. I'm not sure I can make that happen. Sorry, Lucy. But they're very, very cute.
And she's coming with a double whammy. How many birds have you captured? So you went through all the different projects you've worked on. Let's first talk about your powerful owl work. How many powerful owls have you individuals have you handled?
So as part of my PhD, the catching ended up not being a big component of it. So I only handled probably about 3 powerful owls as part of that. And then basically I helped Nick out with his honours and his PhD. And then we had another Nick after that I helped out with his honours as well. So I think from memory, they're up at over 20 owls now that they've captured as part of that project. I haven't been out catching for a while. So 20 sort of plus 3, that would be powerful owls. I've only held 2 barking owls as part of the work up in the Pilliga, and then out East Gippsland. It was 1 sooty owl and a couple of powerful owls. And then Norfolk Island mopoke, I've held 1 Norfolk Island mopoke.
And did you get nibbled or nipped by them? No show of affection from the owl.
None of the. I've never been nipped by any of the others. It was just the mopoke that gave me a little bit of a nip on the hand, but again, it didn't feel like anything.
Yeah, no, they don't kiss. So.
No, they don't. I'm not sure I'd want to put my face anywhere near any of the owls, regardless of whether they're small or not.
Yeah, I've seen the barking owl fairly close up, and it's quite terrifying when it's got its gaze fixed on you and it's annoyed. I think you can tell when they want you to just get lost. You're obviously scaring away other prey and whatnot if you're there, and they're scary. So I would not like to be inches away from the face of a powerful owl. I don't think at all.
I think if you're doing all the right things, like where we are and we're trained in how you do it, it's not that scary. But I would caution people if they're out and about and they see an injured one, that it would probably be better to ring sort of a wildlife care or wildlife organisation to come out and handle it versus you picking it up, because A, you could do damage to the bird, and B, it could do a fair bit of damage to you, even if it's a chick, because the chicks are quite large when they actually come out of the holo. So, yeah.
And they're and they don't get their talons at maturity. They've got them straight away. So yeah.
They have their talons as soon as they come out of the holo.
That's right. They, and they're super sharp, aren't they?
Yes, very sharp and very large as well, and very curved. Perfect for sort of. It offends people sometimes, but perfect for sort of snapping necks to kill their prey, and then being able to carry them around with those talons as well.
Yeah. Actually, that's something I'd never actually thought about. How do they actually kill the prey? Like, do they sort of stand on the back end of it with one foot, and then they're grabbing the head and giving it a twist? Is that?
So I've only ever seen it once, but the one that I saw, it landed sort of on the possum, and one foot was on sort of the body of the possum. The other was on the head, and it was a very quick snap. So the possum actually didn't even make a noise whatsoever because it didn't even see it coming. It was all over before. If you had blinked, you would have missed it pretty much.
Because I guess like you've only seen it once. I guess it's not something that people would see often. So yeah, I'd always imagined that maybe it was a puncture wound, or that they killed them by with the beak or something. But no, it sounds like it's the same way that we would dispatch a chicken or a pigeon.
There are a few raptors that they sort of catch them with the talons, and then the killing blow comes from a bite to the back, to sort of the neck. But the powerfuls and owls, mini owls, as far as I know, do the just a quick snap of the neck sort of thing. And while it's quite rare to actually see them catch prey, it's super common to actually see them sitting during the day with prey in their talons.
With their display. Dr. Nick's been showing us some of those lately on the Twitter feed.
Yeah, lots of down south here in Victoria. It's generally lots of headless possums, but you'll occasionally down here see them with birds and other things. Whereas up north, you get a bigger diversity in their prey, with the flying foxes and that sort of stuff as well.
Well, it's good that for a horrendous murder bird, they sound like they're terrifically humane. So,
hey, we all have to eat. Okay,
that's exactly right.
At least animals only do what they have to do, whereas people aren't so nice about it.
Yeah, actually, what's your thoughts about calling them murder birds?
I think that's terrible.
Oh, oh, gee.
It's just part of their ecology. We can't all eat nuts and berries and whatever else.
That's right. They haven't got a fridge to fill up with tofu, so
yeah,
that's right. Another question. Good on you, Dr. Nick. He's keeping it rolling along. Do females display prey? That is a good question.
Yeah, so both females and males can be holding prey. More commonly, I've seen the male holding prey, but the females do as well. Generally, during sort of the time that they're in the nest, you don't see females holding prey, because the times that they would be holding prey is the times that they're actually in the nest. But yeah, outside the breeding season, definitely.
Now, I've got a question sort of related to that. It seems with a lot of the commentary with the photos that I've been seeing, not only Nick's, but some of the others with ours generally, are males using food as a courtship display? Like, is it like, here, I'm so good, look at the food I can get? Or are females expecting males to feed them, to hunt them and feed them? Do you see the slight distinction between it being ceremonial and being a requirement?
So I guess the first sort of bits of courtship aren't kind of around food so much. When I see it, the first sort of bits of courtship is that they fly in and they sit together and they start sort of doing a bleating sound, which is exactly what it sounds. It sounds a bit like a lamb. They then sort of start preening each other, so nibbling on each other. They then they can nibble on each other's feet as well, that sort of stuff. And then I guess later comes the here, I've got some food, would you like some food, sort of thing. So it's more about reaffirming pair bonds than anything else.
Okay, so it's not like that the male is having to go out and feed the female or
lure her in with prey.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But I guess I've never really thought so much about bringing food back to the Holo either. Is that equally shared, or is one bird, one of the pair, having a greater responsibility for bringing food to the chicks?
So the literature suggests that while the female does all the maternal stuff, so the incubating, the brooding, all of that sort of stuff, the male then is supposed to do the other half, which is sort of the getting the food, killing the food, bringing the food back. It tends to be the female that goes into the Holo to feed the chicks. But again, the literature suggests that. Some observations out in the field actually suggest that sometimes what will happen is the male will call the female out. She'll come out. He'll then sit there and sort of in vicinity of the Holo, and she'll head off and go for a bit of a fly and come back with food sometimes. So I guess it really depends on the pair of powerful owls.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder what Dr. Nick's Brisbane powerful owls do. He might be able to offer a comment. Okay, so you've done the processing. The next thing is that you do a general health check. Is that right?
So basically, once we've done what we need to do, so generally we take a few feather samples just so that we can do some genetics to see who's related to who. We've attached the tracker. It's then time to actually release the owl. Did I have a slide of releasing the owl? I'm pretty sure it's me with my eyes closed holding an owl.
We do. I just thought you'd have to do the health check before we release them. So that was...
No, so we do health checks as we're holding them. So, you know, basically we put our hand up a little bit higher up on their chest just to make sure that, you know, their heart's not beating too fast, all of those sort of things. But when we're actually...
That's a fabulous pick.
Well, I want to make a point here that I'm not chucking the owl in the air. Basically, how we go about doing this is we don't put them down on the ground, because on the ground they're susceptible to different things. So basically what we do when we want to release them is we sort of take we keep the hand on their back. We put them out in front of us. We make sure that we're pointing in a direction where there's a clear line for them to actually fly and land unencumbered in a tree. And then ever so slightly, we start to release the pressure on their feet. We start to move our hand away, and basically they just fly out of our hand and then up into the tree. And this is an example of the same bird sitting there looking down at us. But I actually don't have a photo of me with my eyes open at this point in time, because basically as they flap, it's just the instinct to close your eyes. So every single photo I have of me releasing a powerful owl is with me with my eyes closed and a weird expression on my face. So, but yeah,
I don't think that's surprising at all. Yeah, I don't think that's surprising at all. So I'll just go back. Hello, Melly B Honey from Twitch. It's nice to see someone on Twitch who isn't saying something completely inappropriate. So that was great. I don't know if you noticed, this is what Nick said about the owls he sees.
Yeah, so that's fantastic.
Yeah. So
that's kind of what's supposed to happen, but you know what they say happens in the literature, and sometimes what you observe in a pair, it's slightly different.
I don't know if you just observed my chair failing and me dropping 18 inches in height. So.
I can't see you at the moment. All I can see is myself.
I forgot. That's right. It's on the screen. Oh, that was good.
Yeah.
That gives me the opportunity to fix that, I think.
So I guess another thing to note here is this picture of the powerful owl sitting in a roost is actually the same owl that I'm letting go there. So it takes us a little while to actually pack up. So as we're packing up, we'll just occasionally shoot the head torch over and just make sure that everything looks okay.
Yeah.
And then we'll do sort of a final check before we leave for the night, just to make sure that the transmitter's sitting where it should be, that the owl looks happy, healthy, and not too disgruntled at us. So this one is a female by the look of it, but I couldn't tell you exactly. I find it hard to tell the difference between the two unless they're sitting side by side. But the main sort of difference is that the female is a bit slighter, and she has a much more rounded, small head, versus the male. He's a bit buffier and he has sort of a square head.
Exactly. Big buff head. So I think so. Then you just sort of. That looks like a very unimpressed owl as well, Bronwyn.
So basically, while she may look that she's slightly unimpressed with us, she's actually looking really good. So, you know, then we sort of do next day checks. So the next morning we head out after a catching night to actually check the owl. So she's looking really good. She's sitting there. She's looking comfy. Her tracker, and you might not be able to see this, but it's just a tiny sort of little, and me pointing at the screen is not going to help that, but it's just a tiny little sort of sliver that's sort of in between where her wings fan down, and it's sort of, yeah, so it's kind of in the middle. It's nicely attached.
Yeah.
She's actually sort of preened it in, so it's all covered. It's not sticking out at weird angles. And sort of the other really cool thing here is that this is the next morning. So after we left her, she's gone out and she's caught a possum, and she's now sitting in her diurnal roost. So, you know, all the indicators there are that she's happy, healthy, and that we haven't had any impact on her.
Yeah, it didn't upset her appetite. So
yeah,
that's very good. And there's what's Nick said.
I like that, Dr. Nick. We've noticed that the females often look a bit more startled than the males. Small sample size. I most of my work has been sort of in the urban and urban fringe sites, and I think urban owls are a little bit more blasé about people than forest owls. So when I did my training out in East Gippsland, we couldn't get very close to an owl whatsoever in terms of when it's sitting in its roost. Whereas these urban ones, you know, often we go and we stand underneath them, just check, you know, that everything's looking like it should look, and they don't tend to startle as much. I tell you what, though, back to sort of the ninoxes, I think the ninoxes are the owls that give the best greasies. They definitely show you when they're unimpressed with you just standing there watching them. And that was borderline greasy. But yeah, the males can give you a really good look as well when they're not impressed that you're hanging around.
Oh, no doubt. Look, I lived in East Gippsland for a while, Bronwyn, a number of years, and I didn't find forest owls other than a barking owl, even the boobuks. I think they are very good at knowing when you're around, and they just get the hell out of Dodge. They don't really want to have an interaction with you, I think.
I guess they're less used to people being around as well, so they're more sort of startled by people being around. Whereas, you know, a lot of the owls that I've done work with, you know, sometimes you'll see them roosting a meter away from a jogging track or a common biking track or something like that. So while people might not be stopping to look at them, they're used to people moving past a lot more and are less startled by that than sort of forest owls who live in the middle of nowhere and come across a person once every, I don't know, 6-12 months.
Yeah, and I mean, barn owls, totally different, you know. Barn owls just right through Gippsland. I've seen them in many, many places, and they'll happily sit on a fence close by you. They'll keep a healthy distance, but they're not wanting to hide. They're not wanting to skulk, whereas the forest owls are skulkers, I reckon.
I guess they also hunt differently as well. So, you know, even those sort of barn owls will sit on posts and then they'll take off and they'll go down and they'll pounce. They're often doing that in sort of more open environments, whereas forest owls need to be, you know, really cryptic and not obvious to their prey. So I guess that sort of translates across as well. And the funny thing is, I had to go all the way to Scotland to see my first barn owl. I'd never seen one here in Australia. I saw one in Scotland, and then I came back here and I saw a number of them after that. But it was just, the first one was over in Scotland.
I've seen far more barn owls caught in headlights as a car will be turning around or going round a bend and just catching a barn owl flying close near a fence line or something like that. So if that's anything, let's just go back to the 10 steps again. I think we've covered them all in the slides, obviously. The only question I have on what we've talked about now, Bronwyn, is that idea of the roost sites. Do powerfuls have a number of roost sites? Because I'm thinking that they don't pile up the scat in one spot, like where they're sitting every time they have a meal and having a poop. I'm guessing that it's quite spread out in a number of locations. Am I right?
So I'd like to be able to just pull a number off the top of my head and tell you exactly how many roosts they have.
No.
That's
They're secretive birds. We don't actually know as much as we think we know, probably.
Yeah. So yeah, they do have a number of roosts, and a number of the roosts are more about sort of thermoregulation. So each of their roosts, depending on how high it is, how bushy the tree is, all of those sorts of things change the thermodynamics of sort of the environment. So I think it's more so about that, but they do have a number of different sort of diurnal roosts. They have where they sit and they prey and that sort of thing. One of the things that I've noticed a lot when I'm doing field work is at night times they use a lot of dead sort of branches, even really small ones that come off. And I think that's because it gives them a better view of sort of their surroundings versus being sort of right in close to the tree trunk.
Okay.
But yeah, they have a number of different roosts. They'll roost in native trees. They'll roost in introduced trees. So we sometimes get them in pine trees, and in one of my sites in my PhD, really common to be sitting in the willows right next to the creek line.
Yeah.
And then the willows lose their leaves and they stop roosting in the willows.
Else,
yeah.
I've seen boobuks in liquid ambers in Melbourne. So that huge, like Japanese maple, I think is the common name that we apply to it. But they were really, really popular in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and there's some massive big specimens in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne.
So I think earlier Lucy also asked a question about or Nick asked a question for Lucy about where the the juveniles go. And I think I covered this.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I covered this last time. But just the sort of long and short of it is sometimes we don't know. So there are some occurrences where sort of someone, I think it was Ed McNabb, banded a powerful owl chick in sort of out of the sort of suburbs. And then I think it was Listerfield, actually, from memory. He banded it in Listerfield and it showed up years later in Blackburn. So a lot of the time we actually don't know where they go. The best sort of information that we have is from genetics. We can start to look at the genetics of the owls and how related they are to one another. That's not my area of expertise though, so don't ask me questions about that. As far as I know, nobody has actually tracked a juvenile. We had permission to track juveniles. The problem is that often the trackers don't last long enough and you have to be within a certain range to actually then download the data. You could solve that by putting a satellite tracker on them. However, satellite trackers are immensely expensive and would be something that you would want to get back.
Nick's got another comment there about the different roost sites. So
definitely, I don't know the intricacies of the roost sites versus the temperature, but they definitely do. And when it's rainier, they prefer something that gives them a bit more shelter. So there's all sorts of little aspects like that we probably wouldn't even think about. But yeah.
But if you think about it, your own behaviour.
It's logical.
Yeah, I mean that little spot that you don't mind sitting and reading a book in April is probably a bit too hot to do it in late January. So, yeah, it all makes perfect sense. I did have another question, but it's totally gone when we have that had that discussion. So, Nick and Lucy and Melly B Honey on Twitch. That's good to have. Very excited to have some good Twitch content. I would just like to give them one more opportunity, Bronwyn, to pose a question or two if they have one. I'm throwing this one at you from left field, but not this weekend, but next weekend, World Migratory Bird Day on the 14th. Now, are any owls migratory?
Oh, that's a big question.
I have no idea, so I'm just thinking you probably know more about owls generally than I do.
In Australia, I'd say no.
Yeah, I would say that too for Australia.
In, say, the US, I would guess yes, only simply because a lot of their raptors actually migrate because it gets too cold.
Yeah. So maybe the snowy owl maybe doesn't, but maybe the great horned owl does. Who knows?
Maybe not the great horned owl, because when I was in Tucson, apparently it was the time when all of the birds were migrating and the great horns were still sticking around. So I guess they probably have some that stick around all year round and then others that might be migratory.
Yeah, it's probably a good time for actually this just popped into my head. Do owls only and let's talk about the powerfuls because you've spent more time looking at them. Will they scavenge?
I've never seen them scavenge. I've never seen record of it. From everything that we know, if they catch a prey and they drop it on the ground, they won't go down and get it. It would be very interesting if people have other observations of them and can send those through, because that would be awesome. But from everything that I've seen and everything that I've read, it's they capture live prey, and then if they drop it, they don't go down and get it. It's kind of just some other animal will eat it if they drop it.
Okay, well, if you are catching this as a replay or in the podcast stream, and you have an answer to that, and be that anywhere in the world, please, if you've seen owls scavenge.
I'm sure there's owls somewhere that probably scavenge.
So,
but
just give us an example, an idea, an account of your observation or of one that you've read, and you can send that to my email, grant@thebirdemergency.com, or to me on Twitter @birdemergency, not the bird emergency, @birdemergency, and I will make sure that Bronwyn sees it. Good on, it's the Dr. Nick show. Here we go with some more. Actually, did we talk about this question?
No, we haven't.
Live or dead trees for nesting?
I think it's less about the tree itself being alive or dead. It's more about the dimensions of the actual hollow itself, whether it provides if the hollow is big enough for them to actually get down in there and rear their chicks and that sort of stuff. I've seen both. So, we've seen them in live trees and we've seen them in deadish trees. One year, one of the trees that they were actually nesting in, the entire top snapped off. The canopy snapped off. We had some really high winds and it snapped off while the chick was actually still in the hollow. But the chick successfully fledged not long after that. So that was a good news story, not a terrible news story.
Well, if you put, let's anthropomorphize that situation. That's just like a 4-year-old with, something happens around them and they're playing with their dump truck in the sand pit, and then and then they just keep going, don't they? And making sandcastles at the beach or whatever. So now Nick's got a few more. Well, on the tree, I've got another question about it, because obviously the Holo is the main limiting factor, the size of the Holo. But is the sighting of the tree important? If there was a Holo, if the same Holo existed, roughly, and there's a tree out in a clearing or a tree in a sort of sheltered position, have you noticed that they would select one over the other?
So all of the Holos that I've seen them breed in have generally been surrounded by vegetation. So there's not one just sitting out in the middle of a paddock, for example, and them using it. So I'm sure that sort of that surrounding vegetation is important as well.
Yep. Okay.
And it's that surrounding vegetation is actually really, really important when it comes to the time for the chicks to fledge. So you can imagine being a chick and, not having flown anywhere. Basically, you've only built up your wing muscles by climbing up to the mouth of the Holo and flapping in the Holo for, a couple of weeks. That you take that first flight, and basically you really want vegetation that's close by and at sort of a height where they can sort of just take their first jump out of the nest and sort of land very close by. One of them nearly gave me a heart attack one day when I was out there watching a chick fledge. It basically went to take off and then sort of had second thoughts, and it's kind of tumbled out of the Holo and landed on the side of the same tree, and it's gripping onto this piece of bark that's like just holding on under its weight. And I'm going, who can I call? Who do I know that's got a ladder big enough for us to help this out? And it left me there in suspense for 20 minutes, and then it sort of just took off very gracefully and landed in a tree close by. And I'm like, I can breathe again.
Well, while you're answering our real estate questions, we've got another one. Does the direction of the Holo have an effect on selection?
I actually haven't paid a lot of attention to the direction of the Holo in the recent bit of time, but I'm pretty sure way back when I did my paper in 2018, we actually found that a certain direction of the Holo was better, because it just meant that they weren't that the Holo wasn't as exposed to sort of wind, rain, and that sort of stuff. Off the top of my head, I actually can't remember what direction that was. So I'd have to go back and have a look at that paper. But Lucy could, if she wants to, definitely shoot me an email and I can let her know.
I'd also think that the general topography of the landscape would have an effect on that too, because prevailing winds in different, if you're in a valley or there's a rise or something behind, can have an effect on that. So that's that would be great to do, a really a huge study on our entrances. The front door, our front door, be very interesting. Now, Nick's given us a whole heap of things here. I think he's very lucky that yesterday he saw a grey goshawk. But this is a good question. The goshawk was eating a water dragon. Do powerful owls eat reptiles? Have you ever seen them? Have they picked up a parenti or anything like that?
I think a parenti might be if it was a baby.
It would be
parenti,
a lace monitor, probably, if you're talking East Gippsland. There's plenty of lace monitors around in the forest. So
I've never heard of them taking reptiles. That being said, up until sort of the last 20 years, or a bit more than 20 years now, we thought that they only exist in forests. So, we're constantly learning new things. And we've also learned that their diet is a lot more diverse than what we originally thought. Originally it was, arboreal marsupials, possums and gliders. And now we've actually seen that, they have a much broader diversity in diet. I think there's some photos of a powerful owl holding a brush turkey that I saw somewhere on the internet, and then another one holding a baby koala, which is probably going to annoy koala people out there to no end. But we see different things popping up in their diet that we didn't think that they ate before.
Well, if they're going to be popping up, in the suburbs, the more forests that we cut down and turn into reflex paper in Japan, they got. I mean, we've covered this before in our earlier discussion that if they've got nowhere to live where they want to live, they're going to move somewhere else.
I've actually got a funny story for Nick's next question. We've seen half possums several times under display perches untouched. Well, it's not really a funny story, but I actually, when I was out doing...
Not for the possum anyway, I'm guessing.
When I was out doing playback originally to try and identify if there was an owl in the area, I didn't realize I was standing right near a brush-tailed possum. And as soon as I started playing the playback, the brush-tailed possum lost its absolute mind. It started going off. And I just thought to myself, I understand why it's doing that, but if I was a brush-tailed possum and I heard a predator, I'd actually go silent. I wouldn't start broadcasting. So maybe it had a family close by or something like that.
Well, maybe brush-tails do the meerkat thing, who knows? Now there's a comment about the brush turkeys. Good on you, Nick. What would we do without you? Actually, this is Nick's personal podcast today, so good on him.
I always love hearing these observations of them taking. Well, I live in sort of Victoria, and we're sort of in a fairly urban area, so often the most we see them with is brushtails, ringtails, and cockies, and the occasional currawong, who obviously has annoyed them enough that they decided to eat the currawong.
Now, on that, Nick and Lucy, yes, there we go. We've got to get that right. The currawong or a cockatoo, diurnal species, how are they hunting them? Are they finding them at their roost, or are they doing a daytime hunt because shut up, you're so loud, I've had enough of you, and they just go out and they maliciously knock them off?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. I've never seen a powerful owl hunting during the day. Even when they're being mobbed by currawongs, the most that I've seen a powerful owl do is sort of shift its roost by about 5 meters. Often, basically, all they do is they sort of do this, do a bit of a head bob, and it's sort of just like, yeah, whatever. But yeah, I in my best guess, I would suggest that they hunt them at their roosts, because I've never seen them hunt during the day.
Well, that would be a really interesting question to have answered. I would love to know how a powerful owl is catching. I can kind of see them getting a cocky, easy to see and whatnot, but a currawong, that surprises me. But I guess they taste good,
well, they're definitely an opportunist.
For nothing.
They're definitely an opportunist, and they will eat whatever they can get their talons on. Up in a tree.
Scavenge. Yeah.
No.
But they won't.
Well, I can't say no, never,
right,
because the world is full of possibilities, but I've never heard of or seen evidence of them scavenging.
Our hypothesis is that powerful owls do not scavenge.
Now we need some data.
I'm going to say there's a PhD project for someone else in the lab coming up. So
I think that's probably one of the most fascinating things about working with anything in science is no matter how many questions you answer, it always brings up a whole heap of other questions that you then need more data to actually answer those questions.
Yeah. All right. Well, since we've been talking real estate, we're going to do the going once, going twice. Final chance to pop in another comment, observation, or question before I let Bronwyn go back to teaching people. Surely Dr. Nick's got another. Actually, bats. Nick, I would. Here we go. I want to ask Nick to give us another contribution. Are they hunting flying foxes or smaller bats, Nick? What have you seen them with? There's Nick and Lucy's nice thank you. It's I'm glad you found it informative and interesting. There's nothing more interesting than talking about murder birds, I think, even if we shouldn't call them murder birds.
If you really want to like get into murder birds or anything like that, isn't it the butcher birds that kill things and stick them on sticks?
They're
murder birds
and the old world thrush. But then again, anything grabbing a grasshopper is a murder bird. I mean, a Richard Pippin is a murder bird as far as I'm concerned. So it's just that they're just gorier. They're bigger.
There's levels of murder.
So that's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Speaking of murder birds, flying foxes. There we are. Oh, we saw one male 2 hours ago. There we go. So
yeah, I'd have to say that I've never seen them. Like, we get less flying foxes in talons down here, but there's the occasional one, and I've never seen them take the small bats. I guess that would be a snack for a powerful owl. It'd be sort of like open its mouth and crunch. But I've definitely seen the flying foxes in talons.
Yeah, I guess a small bat is more like a cheezel, so for a powerful owl.
Something like that.
A twisty. So, yeah, horseshoe bat twisty. So, all right. Well, thanks, Bronwyn. Thanks for agreeing to do this again. I'm glad that we've obviously answered just about every question Dr. Nick and Lucy could throw at us. I'm glad that they put the possibility to us on Twitter. Hey, and I'm open to talk to anybody anyone wants to talk to about, as long as I can jam birds, rare birds and threats to birds somehow in the discussion. I'm happy to do it, and also policy. If I can have a whinge about conservation policy, I'll do that. I'll do that too. There we are, 50-50, possums and flying foxes for the local pair. Actually, Nick, while you're paying attention, Nick, how old do you reckon your pair are? They're the UQ pair, aren't they? The University of Queensland pair. Let's just see if Nick and Lucy can answer that, so that I don't have to bombard him on Twitter with that when I remember that I should have asked it in the show. So, actually, Bronwyn, while we're waiting for Nick to get his stuff together and tell me that answer, at what age would a pair of powerful owls start breeding? And do you think the pairs are of a similar age, or will you get, are there sugar daddy owls, or sugar mummy
owls? So I'm not quite sure at what age that they actually start breeding, but you definitely get age differences in the owls. So I know in one site we had a male and a female, and then we think we lost the female because the female's behavior changed entirely, and she looked very different. So they will replace their mates. The females tend to be a little bit choosier and take a little bit longer to replace their mate than the males do. But that's more of an observation than an absolute.
I was going to say, are you sure you're not anthropomorphizing there, Bronwyn?
I think one of the problems is that because they look so much alike, occasionally, unless we do genetics, it could be that one of the pair has actually been replaced and we've just not noticed it, depending on how frequently we're actually checking on them. So, yeah. And I actually gave a talk somewhere once where somebody asked how old do power flowers get? And I'd actually never read anything in the literature that suggests an age for owls, but someone said in excess of 30 years.
I was going to say I read somewhere that that someone made an educated estimate of between 30 and 50 years would be the lifespan, but that the reproductive span would be topping up at about 30 years. And I read that quite a while ago when I was actually preparing for our first discussion. But it was not in a paper. It was more in a a more sort of bird watchy magazine or article or something. So that's why I never quoted it or anything like that. It wasn't actually an academic work. Nick's pair, Nick and Lucy's pair, are near UQ. So in that St Lucia near the river Indooroopilly area, or actually near the campus or at the campus, Nick? I'd be curious to know. Just because that St Lucia Indooroopilly area is a really interesting area with the street plantings and the horticulture and the urban horticulture there. I'd be really interested to know what kind of habitat the birds are preferring there compared to where I know that they hang out in Melbourne. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to Google UQ after this because I don't even know where UQ is. Sorry.
That's cool. Well, I'm assuming that it's only the St Lucia campus, so it's a pretty nice part of town in Brisbane, and I lived in Brisbane for a while. I lived in East Brisbane near and Nick said, bearing in mind what we were saying earlier on, can't give too many details, which is fair enough because we don't want to.
I love that.
We don't want a whole bunch of people heading out there trying to find Nick's powerful owls. So that's fair enough. But yeah, near the river and near the campus, so I get an idea of where it is. I wonder if their hunting range includes that Indooroopilly area. And powerful owls in Brisbane, I think, would be fairly adaptable. A bit like the one she mentioned earlier on, Bronwyn, where you had Listerfield and Blackburn in Melbourne. Now, Listerfield and Blackburn, that's a long way to walk, but it's not really a long way for a big bird to fly, and it's sort of in that. It's sort of in the same corridor. So
they also wouldn't necessarily make it in like a sort of one flight. It could be a gradual sort of transition.
Yeah, that might be a week. That might be a week of moving through an extended territory. So yeah, who knows? We don't know enough, do we? We haven't got enough trackers on enough owls to know.
We've got a lot of question marks. We know some stuff, but we've still got a lot of question marks.
Oh, we do. So we need a whole lot more murder bird ecologists out there.
I'm going to get cards made up with murder bird ecologists.
Well, there might be a T-shirt. There might be a T-shirt coming. I have actually got some just waiting on the prototypes. I've been promising it a long time, but the Bird Emergency merch is coming along, and I'll just put the teaser out there: Big Pecker underpants. So let just consider that. While I'm doing plugs, Bird Nerd Trivia, I wanted to run it every day for the election campaign, but it's just too much because I try and do original questions, just too much. We're going to do 2 a week for the final part of the campaign. So settled on the times because people haven't told me what they prefer. But I'm going to do something on a Saturday, something on a Sunday, and if I put enough questions together, gee, maybe Dr. Nick and Bronwyn and Lucy might want to send me some powerful owl trivia questions. That might be great. Yeah, and then the prizes, you're going to win a heat, and then you'll go into a prize for a T-shirt, and the first T-shirt is Eat, Sleep, Twitch, Repeat. That gives you an idea of that theme. And then I'm hardcore birder. We've also got a hardcore birder with the binoculars on its way. And what else? And I've got the big pecker underpants, and the idea with that is, you could be a stork, you can be a shoebill, you can be a sparrow if you get the theme I'm going on. So there we are. All right, that's we got from murder birds to underpants. Fantastic. Bronwyn, thanks. Been great. Nick, anything else you want to contribute? Or here we go. You have told us here. We'd have no content if it wasn't for Nick. There we go. Mainly possums off nearby roofs, juveniles. That's interesting. So they
actually saw I didn't see the juveniles doing it, but I got a report of juveniles sitting on a tennis court fence watching the tennis ball when they were playing night tennis. And at first I was very skeptical. I'm like, that doesn't sound realistic. But I actually went out there and they had a recording of the juveniles actually doing that. And it was amazing. They were just watching the ball go back and forward over the net.
Wow. Actually, that's raised another question. Thanks, Nick, for putting that in. Because for brush-tailed possums and ringtails, that fences are like a rat run, aren't they? That's their shortcut for everything. So I would imagine that an urban owl, not only a powerful owl, but even the boobooks and maybe even barn owls and whatnot, would be watching those sort of rat runs, and that would be
telephone lines as well,
yeah.
Where people have got above ground telephone lines.
Yeah, bloody ripper. Thanks, Nick. That was fantastic. All right, Bronwyn. Well, thanks again for being part of the bird emergency. Really good to do an in-depth sort of follow-up. And I'm glad you, both Nick and Lucy, found it interesting. And for those people catching the replay or the podcast feed, if you've got suggestions, if you've got questions, grant@thebirdemergency.com or at birdemergency on Twitter. And Bronwyn's Twitter is Raptor Ecologist. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, at Raptor Ecologist.
At Raptor Ecologist. Well, we all know it's an at Twitter. And here we go. Let's just pump up our tyres again. Another comment from Dr. Nick. There we go. That's to build up our self-esteem for the day. Thank you both. Fabulous. There we go. Ripper. Thanks, Bronwyn. I'll be catching up with you again. It's always great to talk owls. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Lucy. Thanks to Melly B Honey on Twitch as well. And thanks for those who have been watching, even if you haven't participated. It's been really, really, really great. This will be out in the feed within a week or so, I would say. So tell your owl friends to get over to Bird Emergency and get onto the earlier episode we did, and then binge watch this one. Bye. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Bronwyn.